I'm Nima Rajan. Many provincial governments are grappling with how to bring the third wave of COVID-19 under control as the more virulent variants of the virus are beginning to dominate and younger, healthier people are getting very sick very quickly.
We're in a situation where everyone is exhausted, not just families, workers, small businesses, frontline workers, but also leaders. This has been a very, very long year. And as a federal government, we've not engaged in pointing fingers or laying blame or judging. We're not going to do that. We are there to help.
From Ontario and Quebec to Alberta and BC, the caseloads of variants are growing, particularly for young people who might still think the virus won't hit them that hard. Well, meanwhile, Federal Health Minister Patty Hajdu says Ottawa wants to make sure Canadians have the necessary documentation for future travel, and that could mean so-called vaccine passports. Vaccine passports have been hotly debated around the world over questions on how much governments, employers, and venues have a right to know about a person's COVID-19 status. Ms. Hajdu says Canada is prepared to align with other countries and is committed to discussing the issue with its international partners. The Alberta government has closed down and fenced off a church that has been charged with refusing to follow COVID-19 health rules. Alberta Health Services, in a statement, says Grace Life Church will remain closed until it shows it will comply with health restrictions. Police and security staff were on hand as metal fencing was erected around the church building earlier today. The church, located just west of Edmonton, had ignored public health warnings for months, and its pastor spent a month in jail. Churches are allowed to be open at 15% capacity, but officials say Grace Life has welcomed hundreds of congregants at its services. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole says Ottawa needs to put more pressure on Iran for a full inquiry and examination of events that led to last January's shoot-down of a passenger plane. Dozens of Canadians or people with ties to Canada were killed. Last month, Canada's Transportation Safety Board said Iranian officials failed to provide evidence that Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 was shot down by mistake. Meanwhile, Defence Minister Harjit Sajjan has appeared to testify before the House of Commons Defence Committee, not his former Chief of Staff, as demanded by a motion supported by the majority of MPs. The Liberal government has said it will not let political staff appear before committees. Instead, Mr. Sajjan was sent to answer questions about the government's handling of sexual misconduct allegations involving General Jonathan Vance rather than Zita Astravaz. Telecom industry experts have told a Commons committee that Rogers Communication should have to divest the wireless assets of Shaw Communications if it is allowed to buy its rival. University of Ottawa professor Michael Geist says Rogers should not be allowed to buy Canada's fourth largest wireless service, Freedom Mobile. He told MPs that Rogers is promising a grab bag of goodies to make the deal more palatable, but it would be preferable to require Rogers and other big network owners to open the networks up for use by other competitors. A federal court judge has ruled a government ban on restocking 3 fish farms in the Discovery Islands would cause irreparable harm to their owners and employees. Justice Peter George Pamel has suspended the ban imposed in December on new fish transfers to 3 fish farms in the area that are to be phased out by July 2022. He says the consequences of the ban for local communities and businesses, particularly during the pandemic, outweigh any evidence he heard on the environmental impact of the farms. A Nova Scotia-based seafood plant faces charges related to the importation of live lobster. The Canada Border Services Agency alleges Atlantic Chican Seafood of Clark's Harbour imported live lobster from the U.S. and exported it to foreign markets as a product of Canada. The agency says an investigation has resulted in 3 charges under the Customs Act for making false statements regarding the origin, weight, and value of exported goods. Atlantic Chican Seafood is scheduled to appear in court on May 17th. Commercial real estate firm CBRE says Canada's downtown office vacancy rate increased for the 4th consecutive quarter to reach 14.3%, which is up from 9.3% in the same quarter of 2020. CBRE says Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver's downtown office vacancy rates grew to 10.6%, 9.1%, and 6.2%, respectively, in the latest quarter. Edmonton and Halifax's downtown office vacancy rates set a roughly 19% in the quarter, which was almost the same as a year ago. All right, stay tuned for more top headlines from across the country as BC's provincial health officer says variants are driving the third wave. Meanwhile, Alberta's premier says rule breaking has led to the return of public health restrictions in the province. That and more news from around the world coming up after the break. So stay tuned. We'll be right back on the Forum Daily. A third wave of the pandemic in BC is being fueled by variants of concern, and the provincial health officer says the situation could get worse.
So far, it is the B117, the UK variant, that is dominating what we're seeing now in British Columbia. It's not the most common strain that we're seeing, but of the variants of concern, it is the most common, with 2,838 people identified carrying this strain.
Dr. Bonnie Henry says the variant first identified in the United Kingdom makes up a third of cases, but that could rise to 60% like in Ontario. However, she says the variant associated with Brazil has been increasing in BC recently, with a lot of transmission among young people. The province reported 1,068 new COVID-19 cases yesterday, including 207 new cases of variants, as well as 3 more deaths. Well, meanwhile, the provincial government says BC saw the highest reported uptake rate of electric vehicles in North America last year. It says electric vehicles made up 9.4% of all light-duty vehicle sales in 2020, just shy of the 10% mandated by 2025. BC's annual zero-emission vehicle report says more than 54,000 light-duty electric vehicles were registered in the province. The report says a vehicle incentive program also spurred sales of electric motorcycles and cargo e-bikes. Premier Jason Kenney says widespread rule breaking has forced his government to bring back tougher public health restrictions. He says failing to do so would cause variant COVID-19 cases to swamp the healthcare system by next month. Retail stores currently have 25% customer capacity, but that will be lowered to 15% starting today, and low-intensity group fitness activities will be banned. Indoor social gatherings remain banned, and outdoor get-togethers can have no more than 10 people. Calgary Mayor Naheed Nenshi says he won't run for a 4th term this fall. Mr. Nenshi was the first Muslim mayor of a big Canadian city, and he was elected in October 2010. The 49-year-old, who has a master's degree from Harvard University, says leading the city has been the honor of his life. Mr. Nenshi, who oversaw Calgary through massive flooding in 2013, says he never expected things could change so much with the COVID-19 pandemic. Saskatchewan plans to run deficits for 2 years longer than planned to pay for the costs of the COVID-19 pandemic. The budget tabled yesterday forecasts a deficit of $2.6 billion. The Moe government says the deficit won't be eliminated until 26-27 or 2026-27 instead of 2024-25 as promised in last fall's election campaign. The plan calls for a 20% tax on the retail price of all vaping liquids, devices and products starting September 1st. Sask Power customers will get a 1-year 10% break on their power bills. Well, it is budget day in Manitoba, and the government is expected to cut some taxes and offer new money to fight COVID-19. Finance Minister Scott Fielding says there will be supports for people who have been hurt by the pandemic's effects on the economy. The government has already said it will follow through on promises to start phasing out the education tax on property and eliminate the provincial sales tax on personal care services. Mr. Fielding says the province is predicting a $1.6 billion deficit. Ottawa-based Spartan Bioscience says it is seeking protection from creditors while it restructures its operations and refines the performance of its rapid COVID-19 test. The company has paused shipments of the product due to a recently identified issue with the system, which it says is not safety-related. Spartan says it remains committed to mobile DNA testing technology in the fight against COVID-19, and Health Canada's authorization remains in place as it works with the company. Quebec is reversing its decision from last month to reopen gyms and to bring back all high school students for in-person classes. Premier François Legault says students in grade 9, 10, and 11 in red zones, including Montreal, will return to alternative schedules of in-person learning, 1 day out of every 2, starting next Monday. Mr. Legault says gyms in red zones will be forced to close on Thursday. As provinces from Quebec westward all grapple with growing case numbers and variants of COVID-19, Atlantic Canada is loosening things up. The region's minimal infection rates means Nova Scotia is opening up its boundary with Newfoundland and Labrador this morning. Premier Ian Rankin says travelers to Nova Scotia will not have to isolate for 2 weeks, and Nova Scotians returning home from Newfoundland and Labrador won't have to quarantine either. Nova Scotia shopping malls, retail businesses, and fitness facilities can return to operating at 100% capacity with physical distancing. Newfoundland and Labrador's Innu Nation says it is astounded to learn of talks about storing nuclear waste in Labrador. Grand Chief Etienne Rich says the federal and provincial government must announce all plans for the project. His comments are in response to a Radio Canada report about alleged secret negotiations. All right, more stories from around the world coming up next after a break, everyone. So stay tuned on the Forum Daily. We'll be right back. U.S. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell says, quote, "It's quite stupid for corporations to speak out against Georgia's new voting law." He intensified his warning to big business yesterday to stand down as Congress delves into voting rights, President Joe Biden's infrastructure package, and other issues. But Mr. McConnell says he still wants companies to donate freely to political campaigns. Last week, Delta Airlines, Coca-Cola, and Major League Baseball voiced opposition to Georgia's new, more restrictive voting law. California has announced plans to lift most COVID-19 restrictions on businesses and workplaces on June 15th.
We have seen our case numbers significantly drop. As a result, today, LA County is entering the orange tier for the first time. Now residents can begin enjoying some fun, recreational, and leisure activities safely and responsibly.
The state's Health and Human Services Secretary says California's mask mandate will remain in effect. He says the most populated state in the U.S. won't reopen more widely unless there's sufficient vaccine supply and hospitalization rates stay low. General Motors says an electric version of the Chevrolet Silverado pickup truck will get an estimated 640 kilometers of range per charge. The company also announced today that the truck would be built at a factory near the border of Detroit. It says it would also build the new 2024 GMC Hummer SUV. The pickup announcement raises the level of competition for future buyers in the hot truck market. Iran has shattered its daily record of new coronavirus infections for the second consecutive day, with 20,954 new cases reported on Wednesday. The country is in the midst of one of the most severe surges of the coronavirus to date, following a 2-week public holiday for Nowruz, the Persian New Year, which drove millions to travel to vacation spots across the country and congregate in homes in defiance of government health guidelines. For months, Iran has struggled to curb the worst outbreak of the coronavirus in the Middle East. 2 UN agencies are warning that over 27 million people in Congo are suffering from acute hunger, a record high. They said this means almost 1/3 of the African nation's estimated 87 million people urgently need food. The Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Program said nearly 7 million people of the needy are at the emergency level. The UN agencies said conflict, especially in the mineral-rich East and Central region, remains a key cause of hunger. The UN says the death toll from tribal violence in Sudan's Darfur region is at least 56. The announcement comes as sporadic clashes continued on Tuesday. The deadly clashes in West Darfur province grew out of a shooting on Saturday that killed 2 people from the Masalit tribe in a camp for displaced people in Janina, the provincial capital. That's according to the UN Humanitarian Affairs Agency. Fighting ensued between the Rizigat and the Masalit tribes, with both mobilizing armed men. Earlier this year, Darfur violence killed 470 people. Workers in Taiwan have removed the last remaining train car in the island's worst rail accident in 7 decades. 50 people died and over 200 were injured in the crash on Friday when the train hit a construction truck that had fallen onto the track. The driver of the truck has been detained on charges of causing death by negligence. He has apologized for the accident and promised to cooperate with investigators. Taiwan's Minister for Transportation and Communications on Wednesday offered his resignation. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has said his country is facing the worst ever situation during a major political conference in Pyongyang. Experts say Mr. Kim is facing perhaps his toughest moment as he approaches a decade in rule, with North Korea's coronavirus lockdown unleashing further shock on an economy devastated by crippling U.S.-led sanctions over his nuclear weapons program. Japan's Toshiba Corporation says it is considering a preliminary acquisition proposal that would make the technology conglomerate private. Toshiba said that it has asked for more details on the proposal it received yesterday, and it was giving it careful consideration and would make an announcement in due course. The major Japanese financial newspaper Nikkei reported international private equity company CVC Capital Partners was looking into acquiring the company for $18 billion US. A Norwegian museum says a famous statue of a baby boy stomping his feet in anger has been removed from a park in the capital, Oslo, for repairs after someone vandalized it by trying to saw off its left ankle. The bronze Sinnataggen sculpture is considered a national treasure and is arguably the most famous work by Norwegian sculptor Gustav Vigeland. The statue was removed for conservation and will be placed back in its original place as soon as possible. All right, more top stories from around the world coming your way after the break. Iran confirms an attack on a cargo ship that is believed to be the base for the Revolutionary Guard. Meanwhile, Russia and Pakistan are set to boost ties in the fight against terrorism. More when we get back. The Iranian government has acknowledged an Iranian cargo ship anchored for years in the Red Sea off Yemen and believed to be a base for the paramilitary Revolutionary Guard has been attacked. Iran's foreign ministry confirmed yesterday's attack on the MV Saviz, suspected to have been carried out by Israel. The assault came as Iran and world powers sat down in Vienna for talks about the U.S. potentially rejoining Tehran's tattered nuclear deal. Russia's foreign minister says Moscow and Islamabad will boost ties in the fight against terrorism. He says Russia will provide unspecified military equipment to Pakistan, and the two will hold joint exercises at sea and in the mountains. Sergei Lavrov's visit today is the first by a Russian foreign minister to Pakistan in 9 years. It comes as Moscow seeks to increase its stature in the region, particularly in Afghanistan, where it has sought to inject itself as a key player in accelerated efforts to find a peaceful end to decades of war. Hong Kong media say 3 activists, including well-known publisher Jimmy Lai, have pleaded guilty to taking part in an unauthorized rally that resulted in violence between police and participants. Mr. Lai is already being held on custody on other charges related to his outspoken opposition to China's crackdown on civil liberties in the former British colony. On Thursday, 7 of Hong Kong's leading democracy advocates, including Mr. Lai and an 82-year-old veteran of the movement, were convicted for organizing a march during massive anti-government protests in 2019 that triggered Beijing's crackdown. China has sentenced a former education official and a former legal official in the northwestern region of Xinjiang to death, with a 2-year reprieve on charges including separatism and bribe-taking. Sattar Sawoot and Shirzat Bawudan are the latest of many Xinjiang bureaucrats, almost all members of the Muslim Turkic Uyghur minority group, to be sentenced on national security charges. A court official said both men pleaded guilty and neither would appeal. China has more than 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims in prison-like re-education centers. Taiwan's foreign minister says the island will defend itself to the very last day if attacked by China. China claims Taiwan as its own territory to be won over peacefully or by force. China flew 10 warplanes into Taiwan's air defense identification zone on Monday and deployed an aircraft carrier group for exercises near Taiwan. China does not recognize Taiwan's democratically elected government, and leader Xi Jinping has said unification between the sides cannot be put off indefinitely. The U.S. State Department says it is talking with allies about China's human rights record and how to handle next year's Beijing Winter Olympics. Human rights groups are protesting China's hosting of the Games that open on February 4th, 2022, alleging Chinese abuses against Uyghurs, Tibetans, and residents of Hong Kong. The death toll from Sunday's mudslides in eastern Indonesia has risen to 126, with scores still missing as rain continues to pound the region. The village of Lemaneli and Adonara Island suffered the highest losses, with 67 bodies recovered so far. On nearby Limbata Island, the downpour triggered by a tropical cyclone sent solidified lava from a volcanic eruption in November to crash down on over a dozen villages, killing at least 28 people. Egypt and Sudan say the latest round of talks over Ethiopia's massive dam have failed. They say no progress was made after Addis Ababa rejected a Sudanese proposal to include international mediators. The latest talks, which ended Tuesday, were held in Kinshasa, Congo, and were meant to address a years-long dispute over a giant dam that Ethiopia is building on the Nile River's main tributary. The talks center on the speed at which a planned reservoir is filled behind the dam. Egypt and Sudan, which are largely desert countries, fear the dam will decrease their access to waters from the Nile. African leaders have rallied in a virtual summit, calling for scaled-up actions and financing to combat the effects of climate change on the continent of 1.3 billion people. Presidents from Congo, Senegal, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and other countries talked about the need for support to accelerate the effort against climate change. It has affected food security, health, and other issues on the continent. One of the few copies of the comic book that introduced Superman to the world has sold for a supersized record-setting price. Online auction company ComicConnect.com announced yesterday that the issue of Action Comics 1 went for $3.25 million US in a private sale. Experts say the comic, published in 1938, is really the beginning of the superhero genre. It also told readers about the origins of Superman, how he came to Earth from another planet and went by Clark Kent. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca. All right, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Take care.